I had another title for this talk today, and I thought I'd share it with you. It's called Torah and the Pleasure Principle. So I want to know, is that an oxymoron? Is it an oxymoron to talk about Torah and the pleasure principle? I wrote a book called Open-Minded Torah. So some people tell me that's a paradox and an oxymoron. I'm not necessarily going to explore that this afternoon. But is it possible to pursue a life of Torah observance and also pursue a life of pleasure? If we had to do a flash, we do this in Israel a lot, a flash seker, a flash, my Hebrew sometimes takes over my English, a flash survey. What does the survey say? Is a life of Torah and pleasure possible? Yes. Well, all of my undergraduates at Bar Ilan, and many of them that I meet across America, almost always when the rabbi leaves the room, say, "What, are you kidding? There's no such thing. No such thing as Torah and the pleasure principle." So for those of you who were here for my earlier talk, I recounted a little bit of my time at Columbia when I was doing my PhD and how I was accused by some of my classmates, and it was implied even by some of my professors, that I had gone off the deep end as soon as I put a kippah on my head. I was called, as I said earlier, the worst of the F words, a fundamentalist. My friends from high school and college, people who I hadn't spoken to for years, suddenly were emailing me, "What's gone wrong with you? What happened to you?" Long, long email exchanges, dialogues. After a while, with dialogues like that, what's the best thing to do? Leave them alone. I found that all of a sudden, it was very popular for a Friday night date. Not with anyone in particular, a date with my friends in the department. Everybody was always coming up to me on Friday morning or Friday afternoon and saying, "Let's go out for sushi tonight," Friday night. They knew that I had recently started to go to synagogue and that in my new Sabbath observance there wasn't a chance. They thought there might be a chance because they knew how much I love sushi. Now, way back then in the 80s, if you wanted to get sushi in New York, as they say in Brooklyn, forget about it. You couldn't get sushi anyplace. Now, Baruch Hashem, if you go to Manhattan and you need to have a atomic teriyaki roll, go out at 3 o'clock in the morning and you can find one. I think there's even something in America called the Kosher Sushi Index. How do you evaluate what city you're going to move your family to? Well, first you check out the schools, then you check out the synagogues. Well, maybe first and foremost, you find out how many sushi restaurants are there going to be that I can go to at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm sure you don't have such things in South Africa, though I did have some very good meat here while I was here. So friends would invite me very, very aggressively to go out. What was their message to me? Do you really want to give this up? I mean, come on. It's so good. Now, these invitations from my friends, and I was among a sophisticated cohort of people, it was really, when you look into it, not just about trying to get me to go out for non-kosher food. What they were saying to me implicitly was, "Listen, Kolbrener, you're one of us. We know you value our values. You value those modern, sometimes liberal values that assert the importance of creativity, autonomy, and independence. And by becoming religious, you're giving up on all of that. You're giving up on the part of yourself that makes you you." So it wasn't only creativity and autonomy and independence. Perhaps underlying all of it was a sense of your own authenticity. How can you live an authentic life? How can you pursue an authentic life if you take on all of these strictures? For them, Torah and the pleasure principle was something that was absolutely impossible. At about the time that I was in graduate school, there was a PBS special For those of you in South Africa or non-Americans, public broadcasting system, something. Part of my background when I grew up. And there was a 6-part interview with a well-known anthropologist. Some of you may be familiar with him. His name was Joseph Campbell. He wrote, his most famous book was called The Power of Myth. Campbell was quite a proficient anthropologist and went to community after community, dozens, maybe hundreds of communities around the world, mostly traditional, what some people call primitive cultures and societies. And he evaluated all of them on many terms, in many terms and many levels. But one of the things that was most important to him was this question: is it possible in this community, whichever one he was describing, to follow your bliss? Follow your bliss was Campbell's motto. It was Campbell's mantra. Follow your bliss. So one of the questions I want to address this afternoon is, as Jews, can we follow our bliss? It's really related to the question of, is Torah and the pleasure principle an oxymoron? Now, in some ways, we have been trained, schooled in a Western culture, in a modern Western culture that's been so influenced by, among other people, Freud, that seems impossible. Freud, among all modern thinkers, and Campbell probably follows from him, argues that theological strictures, restrictions in general, cultural constraints in general, make the pursuit of that authentic self impossible. Freud had an antipathy to religion. And which religion did he feel most ambivalent about? Which he expressed usually not in terms of ambivalence. Now I get to be a Freudian reading Freud. He usually expressed it ambivalently, or not ambivalently, but rather hostilely. What religion was he most hostile towards? His own, Judaism. And he saw in Jewish law and Jewish life strictures which he thought made Jews neurotic. I guess in some sense, he's right. But he calls all of Judaism and the restrictions and laws of Jewish life as creating an obsessional life of neuroses. So as Westerners, as modern people living in the 20th and then the 21st century, it's almost impossible not to internalize this perspective and to think that in some sense, by embracing a religious life, we're giving up on our authenticity. I said earlier that my friends from high school and college looked at me as if somehow I was giving up on crucial questions. They told me, we're living with doubt, we're living with existential honesty. Well, a person embracing Jewish life and Jewish law was necessarily turning away from that authenticity and that autonomy. It's a question I asked myself for many, many years. My friends continue to ask me, can we hold on to this existential authenticity? Can we be, as my friends say to me all the time, be real? Can we be real and be Jewish? So the question about coming out to sushi was not about tuna or salmon. It was much deeper. So I thought maybe in order to answer this question today, I would explore a couple of areas and then return to the issue at hand. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the relationship our sages have to Greek culture. What do our sages think about Greece? Then I want to talk about a kind of, let's put it in academic terms, I am an academic after all, the hierarchy of the senses. I need to know my cultural references here. As I mentioned earlier, I just found out that television did not come to South Africa until 1976, which I find extraordinary. And I mentioned that I was doing a lot of research on television while you guys were reading books. So I need to know if the cultural references are going to work here. David Letterman works for you guys? Oh, Baruch Hashem. Good. So he's got this like top 10 list. So I want to talk about a hierarchy of the senses. So how many do we going to have on the list? I don't think we can do 10, can we? How many? 5. Oh, Baruch Hashem. You know, I was in New Haven in Yale a few months ago and somebody said 7. 6 throws me off, but 7 was like a whole long digression that I couldn't get into. In the end, I had to refer to the local rabbi. Whatever. And as I said, after that discussion, after we do a hierarchy of the senses, we'll come back to our issue. So first of all, what kind of relationship do the sages have to Greece? As we know, as many of us know, the sages of the Talmud separate the world into 4 historical periods. There were 4 kingdoms. What are the first 2 and then the 4th? Somebody, pardon? Babylon? Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and Edom. Excellent. I think we got them all. Now, if you had to, let's focus on Greece. What's the Hebrew word for Greece? Yavan. So if we had to think of a characteristic of Greece, a midah, an attribute, what would be the midah characteristic that you would associate with the Greeks? I can't believe it. People, I can't hear because everybody's calling out at once. I'm so happy. Yeah. What? Bankruptcy. You know, I just got that. I wasn't sure where that was coming from, but I got it now. We're talking about Rabbi. We're talking about ancient Greece. Ancient Greece. You're still holding that? Okay, so somebody said, what did you say? Yeah? Living for today. We can say in Latin, carpe diem. Live for the seize the day. So sexuality, maybe we would. What would be a broader term for that? Hedonism. Guys, you have strong opinions about the Greeks. Do we have Greek envy here? Maybe I don't. So hedonism, sensuality. Is there anything in the Torah that would lead us to suggest that's the case? Pardon? What? Beauty. The verse in the Torah actually associates the Greek nation with Yofi. The sages actually say something different, and none of you said it, I don't think, yet. Oh, learning also. Why would we say learning? Oh, so Plato and Aristotle and all the philosophers. What would be a Hebrew word for referring to that trend in Greek culture? This is actually what the sages say about the Greeks. They have chachma, wisdom. It's very interesting. Somebody tells you there is wisdom among the nations, what should you say? Can you believe them? Somebody says there's wisdom among the nations, can you believe them? Yes. If somebody says there's Torah among the nations, can you believe them? So that you say no. But wisdom, yes. So our sages actually say that we can learn from other nations, and above all, superlatively, from the Greek nation, which is associated with wisdom. And Greek wisdom, as the Maharal says, on this principle of the sages, spread. It became universal. In some sense, what that means is no matter where we are, whether we're in Cape Town or Johannesburg or New York, or even, though I wouldn't say it there, Mea Sharim in Yerushalayim in Jerusalem, we all think like Greeks. Not that we're born with Greek cognitive equipment, but in Western culture we tend to think like Greeks. We approach things like Greeks do. Now, this relationship that the sages have to the Greek world is clarified by an event on the liturgical calendar. There I go sounding like an academic again. What does liturgical calendar mean? Oh, the Luach. Can we find a middle ground between Luach and liturgical calendar? I guess the series of holidays. Now, the rhythm of Jewish life. In some sense, the rhythm of Jewish life is mapped out or felt through the rhythm of the Jewish holidays. In those Jewish holidays, very often, what do we do? Well, no, the first thing we do, we have an obsessive relationship to food. First, we overeat. Then, we fast. So think about the Jewish calendar. How about last winter? Oh, 1 second. I have to remember where I am. How about last summer? What holiday was celebrated? That's so weird for me. Hanukkah. So if you're in Israel, what do you do on Hanukkah? Potato latkes. But it's a little bit different in Israel. On Rosh Chodesh Kislev, on the first of the month of Kislev, you walk into Machne Yehuda, the main shuk in Jerusalem, and what do you find? Jelly donut celebration. An explosion of jelly donuts. How many jelly donuts can one person eat? Celebrate Hanukkah in Jerusalem and find out. So there is also this rhythm of overeating and fasting. That is, right after the holiday of Hanukkah, on the 10th of Tevet, there is a fast. You're so enthusiastic, you're giving the answer before I ask the question. Does anybody know? Does anybody know why we fast? So before we have the answer, almost all of the fasts are related in some way to the destruction of the temple, which ends on the 9th of Av. But there is another reason for the fast, and that is the translation of the Bible into Greek. Now, I know we're a neurotic people, but why would we fast about a translation? Do we have something against bookstores? We don't like Amazon? I wrote my dissertation, as I mentioned earlier, about John Milton, who wrote this famous tract against censorship. And somebody once wrote to me and said, "Shame on you. How could you talk in the way you do? Why should we fast about a translation?" So why would that be? Why fast for a translation? So we have, it looks like we have two authoritative perspectives. First, the young lady over here. Yes? Speak loudly. Okay, you're going to go much too more sophisticated. Let's start with the easy part that you said. We're afraid of mistranslation. Did you want to add to that?
Yes, because you also narrow the opportunity that one word can have so many meanings and you choose one.
It's nice to be in the presence of so many experts. So thank you both. So I would put it in shorthand like that, another cultural reference for me, that Bill Murray movie, things get lost in translation. But is that a reason to fast? Does anybody here use any translations? Not me. Oh, wait a second. I have my Art Scroll Siddur, my Art Scroll Gemara, my Art Scroll Tanakh. They're all in English. So what could be wrong with translation? I mean, we might have to factor in something else. It's very hard to do a soundbite for Judaism. On the one hand, we fast. On the other hand, in the beginning of Deuteronomy, Moses is commanded by God to do what? To translate the Torah into 70 languages. And some of the commentators explain, why is that the case? Because people like us are going to go back to the sources after many years, many centuries, many generations of being away from that source. And in order to get access, we're going to need that translation. So how do we make sense of this? There must be something aside from the internal loss in the text. Is anything else changes? Yes, Ilan, yeah? Yeah.
Basically, it was used to try and embarrass the Jews. They wanted to say, it wasn't used for good motives.
So the motivations, first of all, well, what's the story of this translation? Do people know it? Who was the Greek king who demanded it? Ptolemy, who you may know also as a cartographer, a cosmologist. We went from a Ptolemaic version of the universe to a Copernican view of the universe. How did Ptolemy arrange for this translation? He gathered the 70 members of the Sanhedrin. I mean, some of us know the story, and miraculously they put together a translation which is known in Hebrew as the Targum Shivim. In Greek, what is it known as? Now we can turn to you. The Septuagint, which has inside of it, hiding that word, the translation of the 70. But still, so you're right, it was used against the Jews. But I'm wondering, what about our relationship to this, to Torah? How did the translation change that? You're our expert today, go for it.
Judaism will not be the vehicle which you have to access the Torah.
Pardon?
Judaism will not be the vehicle which you have to access the Torah.
She's actually going to be lecturing at the Sinai in Indaba next year. She said that Judaism is no longer going to be the vehicle through which one has to access the Torah. I'll put it in a little bit more concrete terms. What's the difference? I'm going to ask a question based upon what you just said. What's the difference between going to the library and finding the Torah and going to the Beit Midrash and learning Torah? First of all, where will I find the Torah in the library? Does anybody know the Dewey Decimal Number? The Library of Congress number? I guess that's American. The call number in South Africa, where would I find it? In the 200s. That's useful. Where else? So I know where to look. What else? So we've got so many experts here. What else will I find in the 200s? So we would find sacred texts, as it were, of other religions. What's the effect of that? What's the effect of that on the Jewish person who goes there, who goes to the library? Choice. First of all, what will it even be called? What might it be called? Well, so I'm entering, when I go to the 200s, I'm entering this realm of comparative religion. I'm looking for the Torah. What might I find instead? With the same text inside. Well, I might find, so I'm going to find sacred books of other religions, but I might find a text called the Old Testament. Is that our book? Well, it's already in the context of another tradition. A colleague of mine wrote a very brief article about what he calls the violence of the hyphen in the term Judeo-Christian. Hear that? The violence of the hyphen in the term Judeo-Christian. What does Judeo-Christian usually mean? Christian. So the text that was once part of a living tradition is now on the shelf, and there's this sense of equivalence. There are many different texts. I'm standing outside of the text. For me, in some sense, the difference in the terms, Americans at least, use to talk about university study and Torah learning are themselves resonant. You study literature. You learn Torah. I remember when I was at Columbia Library and I had my place and I was writing my dissertation, and I'm really going to date myself right now, I sat with quotations from all the authors I was writing about on index cards. Do they still make those? There must be an application for that, right? Yeah, you can download it from the iTunes store, right? So I had my authors, my Milton, and my Shakespeare, my John Donne, and my Bacon, the thinker, not the food. These guys over here are already worried about that, right? No, not the food. And I remember feeling this sense of mastery while I'm studying. I'm got these cards in front of me, and I'm moving them around and manipulating them, and I have this real sense that I am in control of this material. And I created an argument through putting these different quotes in different order, and eventually wrote my dissertation. Now in the Beit Midrash, something else is happening. Learning is happening. First of all, how does it look different? Go to a library. What do you hear? Shh. How about a Beit Midrash? I remember my first experience of the Beit Midrash was in Efrat, which is in Yehuda, or some of you might call it the West Bank or whatever. And I walk into this place, and they're shouting at each other. And I get concerned because everybody's in the army, they have guns. They're really enthusiastic. So first of all, the form of learning is different. Noise level. Also, what else is characteristic of Torah learning? Argument between whom? So we learn in chavruta. We learn in chavrusa. We learn in pairs. So what voices do you hear when you're learning in chavruta? You hear the voice of the other you're learning with, hopefully. Right? That's one of the great things about learning Torah is you have to learn how to listen to somebody else aside from yourself, which is hard. What else might you hear? Okay. But I'm even beyond that. You hear the voice maybe of tradition. You hear the voice of God. You hear a whole sets of generations speaking through these texts. When I'm learning, it's not like when I'm in the library. When I'm learning, I'm being addressed. Somebody is talking to me. Remember that Martin Scorsese movie with Robert De Niro? De Niro looks menacingly in the mirror and says, "You talking to me?" Remember that? Why is that a threatening thing? You talking to me? Because when somebody is talking to you, you're being addressed. And when you're being addressed, what might follow from that? I may have to change. Part of my response may be, I need to change. I'm implicated. That's not so in the world of the university. What Autonomy did was to really take, this young lady said, to make Judaism accessible in another form. Distance itself, distant Jewish texts from Jewish learning. We're not so much the people of the book. That's a lie, another lie I learned on public television. We're the people of a living tradition. And Autonomy took this living tradition and made it something that was to which we were outsiders. We're looking at the books on the shelf. We're objective. Is it bad to be objective? Not bad to be objective, but there may be something else, a kind of engagement, a kind of involvement. And that engagement and involvement, Autonomy made impossible. He made us strangers, foreigners to our own tradition. And in that sense, that's the reason why we fast on the 10th of Teves. Because we lost that living relationship. That sense of a tradition being alive for us, of being connected. Again, this emphasis on seeing from the outside. It's good to be objective, but there's a kind of distillation of the culture of objectivity, which is summed up in one word, which I hear from my students all the time, from my kids sometimes, and I even find myself sometimes saying it. I don't know, maybe you say it sometimes yourselves. And that is, whatever. That's when objectivity turns into indifference and apathy. We fast on the 10th of Teves because of whatever. A hierarchy of the senses. We don't have that much time left, so we'll skip down to 5. Let's do a top 2, top 3. What's the most important sense? So you say sight. So speech is really not a sense, connected more to hearing, right? Sight or hearing. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Hearing. Well, Rabbeinu Yonah, a 14th century commentator and philosopher, had just our question. This is on, I think, the sheets that I gave you. King Solomon has said, "The light of the eyes rejoices the heart, and a good report makes the bones fat." Let's read that again. The light of the eyes rejoices the heart, sight rejoices the heart, and a good report, hearing makes the bones fat. We'll have to explore that metaphor in a second. The ear that hearkens to the reproof of life abides among the wise. It is for all who are wise in heart to know that it is inconceivable that King Solomon wrote empty words in the midst of words of reproof and fear of God. The interpretation then is as follows. The light of the eyes rejoices the heart. The eye is a very noble organ, for through it the illuminations which gladden the heart are seen. Of even greater nobility is the ear, through which good reports are heard, which fatten the bone. Why is hearing better than seeing for Rabbeinu Yonah? Because King Solomon says in Proverbs, the light of the eyes rejoices the heart. Hearing fattens the bones. Why is one better? Maybe the heart is something which is relatively, especially according to medieval physiology, alive, while the bones are relatively less alive. Yet hearing, it penetrates you. It gets inside of you. Whenever the Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Torah, gets to the word shmi'ah, almost without exception, it uses the word to translate Kabbalah. What does Kabbalah mean? Not what Madonna does, right? What does Kabbalah mean? So literally it means to receive. Anything else? To accept. How about something with some psychological or psychoanalytic resonance? Integrate, or really following Rabbeinu Yonah, to internalize. Hearing allows one to internalize. Learning for Jews is just not cognitive. It's with our whole bodies. It's a matter of integration. It's a matter not only of hearing, but of connecting. Through hearing, I connect to my tradition. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, Aseh lecha rav, make for yourself a rabbi. What does that mean? Aseh lecha rav? Why doesn't it say find a rav? Find a rabbi. Because the Mishnah doesn't want us to look up somebody in the phone book. The Mishnah doesn't want us to find somebody to call up and say, what time is Shabbos this week? Or can you come and kosher my oven? The Mishnah wants us to make a connection. Rashi says, don't think you can learn everything by yourself. You know how many friends like this? Self-made men, self-taught men, right? They get irritating after a while. They know everything. The Mishnah says, don't be like that. Place yourself in relationship to, and Rashi uses an interesting word here, the shmu'ah, the thing that is heard. Connect. Connect through hearing. The Maharal of Prague describes a Gemara. Some of you may know this. The laws of damage. If somebody, God forbid, causes somebody else to lose their limb, how are they compensated? You cut their limb off? What do? Oh, you pay, how can you quantify a limb? You can, but we do, right? Lawyers do it all the time today, right? If somebody causes somebody to lose their sight, what do? You compensate them for their loss of sight. If somebody causes someone else to lose their hearing, how are they compensated? Surprisingly, the Gemara says, for the worth of their value of the whole person. Again, can you quantify a human life? No, but we do. So while philosophers and playwrights ask, what is man? And answer, the person who thinks, the rational animal. Our sages ask, what is man? And the answer to that is a person who hears. In our generation, of course, that may be different because of technologies and changes. It's a person who hears. It's through hearing that I connect. We think as Westerners, when we have laws, we think of them as constraints, as things that restrict us. But from a Jewish perspective, those so-called constraints are really opportunities for connection. What kind of connections do I make? I think of them sometimes as vertical and horizontal. So vertically, I connect with my parents. Who else might I connect with? So let's go vertically first. Teachers, rabbis, grandparents. How far up can I go? Well, I was thinking maybe not of the human, but of the divine. That if through my connecting, I can connect upwards. What about horizontally? Siblings, community, kihila. That I have all these horizontal connections as well. That is, through these connections, I have the opportunity to grow. Not restraint as limitation, but connection as a way of finding and becoming myself. I think the Baal Shem Tov says that there are 600,000 letters in the Torah and 600,000 letters, 600,000 men gathered at Har Sinai. For every person, there is a letter. In order for me to find who I am, what do I need to do? I have to connect to my letter. And only I can connect with that one letter in the Torah. Only I can bring that letter into the world. As we said earlier, a Sefer Torah that lacks one letter, it's invalid, it's pasul. So I find myself, and this is counterintuitive from a Western perspective, I find myself through connection. But that sometimes can be a risky business. The Midrash describes the giving of the Torah on Har Sinai. And it says that with every one of the divine utterances, the people of Israel gathered at the foot of the mountain, their souls expired. Depressing, right? But, Baruch Hashem, for each person there was an angel that comes and revives them. But then there's another divine utterance. What happens? They die again. Isn't that depressing? If you were running a beginner's service, would you tell that to your beginning congregants? Let's leave that one out. What is that midrash trying to convey? Is there anything positive there? Yes, Torah is a risky business because I am being addressed. When I connect and I hear, there's a chance that I'm going to change. And a person who hears and in your language integrates, every moment he hears the divine command, he's potentially, possibly, a new person. Neuroscientists have discovered that the brain is changing at a constant rate. So a snapshot of the brain now and now will be totally different. The term that neuroscientists use to describe this is neuroplasticity. I would want to coin a new phrase and talk not about neuroplasticity, but neshama plasticity. The changing or the possibility of changing. Connecting has its risks, but it has its enormous rewards. Because by connecting, there's the possibility that I can discover parts of myself that I never knew. I had this experience years ago in relationship to one of my kids. I have some nephews, again, cultural references here, but I'll do my best, who live in Denver. And the NBA basketball All-Star game was taking place in Denver that year. And my nephews, my son's cousins, were bragging about getting to see the Shack Attack. Is that resonant here? A famous American basketball player. My son is like, well, my son didn't really care. But I thought, not only am I depriving myself of sushi, but now I'm depriving my son of the shack attack of the NBA basketball game. Of course, now I would just TiVo it and record the game and everybody would be happy. But at the time, I was depressed. The game was on a Thursday. That Shabbos, my son in the afternoon vanishes. I have no idea why. I'm fantasizing maybe he's still thinking about the basketball game. He comes back, we live in Jerusalem, after sunset, and he asks me, and I'm, of course, you know, when your kid doesn't come back when it's getting dark in Jerusalem, you start to worry a little bit. So he comes back, I'm like, okay, Moshe, where were you? At the hospital? Oh, right, I'm really reassured. What were you doing at the hospital? I was visiting my friend Shlomi. Shlomi, it turned out, had had an appendectomy, an emergency appendectomy. And when my irritation and maybe even anger faded, I saw that my son's face was glowing. And I was trying to figure out, why was he glowing? It seemed to me, in the terms that we've been using, he connected. Who did he connect with? What was the nature of these connections? First of all, he connected with his friend by doing the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, of visiting the sick. Second of all, in some sense, he had connected with God by doing the mitzvah. Also, by telling me of the mitzvah that he did, he was connecting with me. Now, as you may know, the root of the word mitzvah is tzevet. And tzevet means to join. Through doing mitzvot, we have an opportunity of joining in many different ways, of connecting. Again, the world of the university, it turns, and I teach in the university, it turns into this realm of whatever, be objective, be disengaged. The university mitzvah is to be disengaged. The embarrassment of commitment, the embarrassment of connection. In England, when I was in Oxford, there was an English expression. The English expression is, come off it. Don't get too enthusiastic. It's embarrassing to be too enthusiastic. It's embarrassing to be committed. But my son, when he came back from the hospital that day, he was glowing. He had discovered a different kind of pleasure. A pleasure based not on renouncing the relationships that we have, which is so much part of a modern culture. I renounce authority, I renounce tradition, even chas v'sholom, I renounce my family. Our notion of pleasure comes from connection. Through those connections, we have so many new possible opportunities. So I know there's still a long day ahead, so I'd just like to end with one final word, and that is enjoy. Thanks.